Welcome everybody to today's session. This is a session on anti-racist teaching of writing. This is part of the Nevada English Co-Requisite English Task Force. It's been part of a whole series of professional development that is being brought to you by the Nevada System of Higher Education and Complete College America. Today's session is going to be presented by Dr. Iris Ruiz from the University of California, Merced, and Dr. Wonderful Faison from Langston University. I think you're in for a real treat and a very engaging topic today. We're going to begin today with some land acknowledgements. And before I even do these land acknowledgements, I want to acknowledge that as we reached out to the colleges and universities in Nevada, several already had land acknowledgements. There was also some that are in the process of creating these. And so this is an ongoing process, but we always want to begin with this. So I will read these, though you also see them on your screen. I apologize for any mispronunciations I may make, as I am not from Nevada myself. So the University of Nevada, Las Vegas wishes to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities of this region and recognize that the university is situated on the traditional homelands of the Nuwuvi Southern Paiute people. We offer gratitude for the land itself, for those who have stewarded it for generations, and for the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in community with this land. We acknowledge that Truckee Meadows Community College is situated on the traditional homelands of the Numu, or Northern Paiute, Wasi, or Washoe, Miwi, Western Shoshone, Nuwu, Southern Paiute peoples. These lands have been a place of gathering for indigenous peoples, and we honor the original caretakers. We recognize their deep connections to these places and extend our appreciation for the opportunity to live and learn in this space. As we gather here today, we would like to acknowledge, honor, and celebrate the land and resources we are using to sustain ourselves at Nevada State College. We are upon sacred ancestral land of the Southern Paiute, Wallapai, Chemehuevi people who continue to live and thrive all around Southern Nevada. During today's event, we ask all participants to thoughtfully reflect upon ways we as a society benefit from Native lands, how we treat Native people, and how we can strive to do better. Western Nevada College acknowledges that its campuses are situated on the traditional homelands of the Wasi, Washoe, Numu, Northern Paiute, Newe, Western Shoshone, and Nuwu, Southern Paiute peoples. These lands have been a place of gathering for indigenous peoples, and we honor the original caretakers. We recognize their deep connections to these places and extend our appreciation for the opportunity to live and learn in this space. We at the University of Nevada, Reno, UNR, we acknowledge that we work, study, and learn in the traditional homelands of the Numu, Northern Paiute, Wasi, Washoe, Newe, Western Shoshone, Nuwu, Southern Paiute peoples. I also want to do an introduction, as I have in the past, to Complete College America. While I won't read our whole mission and vision, I do want to point out two things. We are focused on a singular goal, and that is increasing college completion rates and closing institutional performance gaps. And while those sound like two, we see them as linked, and so we see them as one and the same, because you can't do one without the other. And we use the term institutional performance gaps because of the work of Estella Ben-Simon at the Center for Urban Education. And it's really pointed out in vision, because we know we can make a difference when our institutions, our policymakers, our systems make the changes that impact student outcomes and student success. The work that we're doing with co-requisite support is a prime example of this, and we salute the work being done in the state of Nevada. Complete College America is known for our strategies, and these are divided into 4 pillars of purpose, momentum, structure, and support. While there's 18 different strategies and they're comprehensive, I want to point out that co-requisite is part of those. And so the work that you are doing in your state to move co-requisite at scale has been proven to work. We've seen these results in multiple states that we've worked with, and we're glad to be supporting these efforts today. We know that you're in front of a computer because we're offering this remotely. So if you can go to Complete College America, you can log in You can create a profile and you can have access to lots of resources, including our most recent publication that just came out in the past couple of weeks. It's on co-requisite support, so it could not be more timely, showing the importance, showing the data, as well as giving specific recommendations. That is called No Room for Doubt, Moving Co-Requisite Support from Idea to Imperative, and we encourage all of you to be able to check that out today. I think Renee is probably putting some links in. Thank you, Renee. And we'll continue to put some links in. She'll also put in a link to the Nevada System of Higher Education website, where you can find the resources for the professional development we've been doing, as well as other resources for co-requisite support. As I mentioned, this is part of a larger series, and you see on the screen, we have a couple more coming up next week. There's one that starred because that was added, and that does have a separate registration. If you've registered for the whole series, you would need to do a separate registration for that. But we also show this because all of these have been recorded, again, available on the website that Renee just shared in the chat. You'll be able to see past presentations, and we encourage you to be able to do so. This is a very thorough and complete series. And with that, what I would like to do is I would like to invite Crystal Abba. She's the Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs. She's from the Nevada System of Higher Education, and she would like to address the group and give a welcome. Please, Crystal.
Good morning, everyone. As Brandon indicated, I am Crystal Abba, the Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs here with the Nevada System of Higher Education. I wanted to take this opportunity to do two things. One, say happy Friday, because I know we're all grateful that it's Friday and we made it through yet another week. But also to thank CCA and Brandon in particular for their support in all of these webinars. I also have to extend a grateful thank you to Wonderful and Iris for their help today. I cannot think of a better way to spend a Friday than sharing best practices with your colleagues, especially on a topic that is so important like anti-racist teachings in writing. So thank you all, and enjoy today's webinar.
Great. Thank you, Crystal. I'm also going to put in the chat one thing. I'll put it at the end, but just so you have it now, which is your feedback is important to us. So we do ask you to complete an evaluation when we conclude today's webinar. As I mentioned, we're going to have two really wonderful presenters. We're very excited to have them. We've been working with them for months, Dr. Iris Ruiz and Dr. Wonderful Faison. They're each going to take turns presenting on today's topic, and we're going to start with Dr. Iris Ruiz, if you would like to take it away.
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciated the land acknowledgement, and I just wanted us to keep that in mind. It's definitely one thing that we think about when approaching decolonial pedagogies. With that in mind, I'd like to go ahead and start off just with a little tune that we can think about. One of the things that, one of the ways I like to approach anti-racism is that it's a type of healing pedagogy. It's a kind of healing approach. And so this particular little song here is called The Culture Cures.
Ome, yay, now. Cultura basura. Cultura basura. Cultura basura. Cultura basura. Ome, yay, now. Cultura basura. Cultura basura. Cultura basura. Cultura basura.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and put my earbuds in so we can get started. I have a couple of links to share with you all. So the first link I'd like to share is my Padlet. I believe it's already been shared with you once before, but just to make sure, I'm going to go ahead and drop the link to the Padlet in the chat. And then I'm going to drop in some supplemental notes and materials that we're going to be doing a little activity on. That also includes the Padlet password. It also will give some instructions on how to be able to read the Padlet and also some descriptions of what each one of the colors means on the Padlet. I hope you all are doing well today. TGIF, I'm really happy that it's Friday. We actually have about 2 weeks left of the semester. So before going into the actual Padlet, I just wanted to say a little bit about me, and I really appreciate, Brandon, the invitation and also the introduction. So I've been teaching FYC, basically first year composition, for about 20 years now. I started with my master's and then went into PhD program at UC San Diego. I've experimented quite a bit with various different types of multicultural approaches, pedagogical approaches in the literacy environment. I've been committed to a type of integration of, multicultural approaches in first year writing for many, many years, since the very beginning. So I've tried so many different, I've been experimented with a lot of different types of like literacy narratives, culturally based essay writing, looking at cultural traditions, etc. And I've written my monograph on what my exploration was with those various pedagogical approaches, coming to a point to where I felt that a critical historical approach within first year writing environments has actually been very, very successful. So since my dissertation in 2010, these are the types of approaches that I've been employing in the first year writing classroom, are critical historical approaches that particularly focus on intersectional, decolonial, and anti-racist approaches to writing. So my commitment's been pretty strong since the very beginning. I don't know if you've heard about it, but I've also recently been involved with the task force revision statement of the Council of Writing Program Administrators outcomes, and we've been trying to bring in an anti-racist approach to the outcomes as well. I've taught at both Hispanic serving institutions, and I've also taught at a PWI, predominantly white institution. I'd like to also say that these pedagogical approaches have been successful in both places. And I've actually also been a part of a mainstreaming project in which the remedial portion of first year composition was basically, it was, they no longer did remedial education, became mainstreamed in the first year composition credit course going forward. Something a little bit more, present is that I feel that in the last couple of years, due to COVID and also due to the George Floyd movement and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, what we're seeing in the institution is a direct response to those political movements, and also, the public health movement, and understanding how we're really all interconnected, with the process of COVID and everything that we've experienced over the past year or so. So we all understand that we're under these, these stressors that we aren't necessarily familiar with how to handle, but we do realize our connectedness. So I would say then that these moments, these political happenings, what we're witnessing here with various race relations and our attention to race, also calls for us to realize that there is a paradigmatic shift that is taking place within higher education. And I think the mainstreaming is part of it, not necessarily having the co-requisite is part of that, because we're understanding that our demographics are changing within higher institution, but there's also something a little bit bigger that I think is going on. And we can see that with, for example, with many colleges wanting to have land acknowledgements in their strategic plans and on their websites as a welcoming message to their campuses. And they're also their commitment to anti-racism, to Black Lives Matter, to affirming the lives of people of color, et cetera, in their strategic plans. We can also see, universities being very publicly committed to that, which is something we might not necessarily have seen in the past. So we can kind of call that or consider that to be the type of paradigmatic shift within higher education. And so we understand too, from what we have seen in the media, is that racism is a very real phenomenon, and we witness that. We can witness it more so now with multimedia. And I believe that's it before we get started. So if we want to go ahead and look at the notes together, hopefully you're all able to look at it. I want to make a little note of what do the different colors mean. Well, what I want us to think about is that at the very beginning level is at a macro level. So macro level meaning, what is the pedagogical frameworks, right, that are embedded within anti-racist approaches based upon feminism, intersectional feminism, and decolonial framework. So we wanted to think about what is the purpose of having a framework, a pedagogical framework that serves as the cohesive type of ideology, right? Or the cohesive type of pedagogical links within our curricular approaches. So we're thinking about how overall from the macro level, we think about what our course learning outcome goals are, right? In the various like 10 to 16 week period, we think about what those goals are. We want to already start thinking about how the framework is going to contribute to those goals, which in which we're trying to work towards an anti-racist approach and raising the awareness of our students of what anti-racism is through literacy activities. Right. So the pink, is giving some types of pedagogical framework materials that can help us to get into understanding why a decolonial approach is important and how it is a type of anti-racist approach as well. And then when we see the violet color, then we're looking at examples and resources for going beyond just kind of a general understanding of intersectionality and gender and bringing more so a focus on women of color. So looking at decolonial feminist approaches and then the actual curricular literacy activities. So we kind of have the framework, but then we're going into the actual activities. And then yellow, when we see the yellow color, we're looking more so at accessibility. So decolonial framework as an accessibility issue. And when we think about accessibility, we're thinking about the structural aspects and the technical aspects of our course, such as a syllabus, right? So how is our syllabus? How is it welcoming? Does it contain a land acknowledgement? What does the language sound like? Those are the types of things that we would think about in that particular version of accessibility, right? And then green, we have some student assignment examples that'll, kind of say, well, what are the results of this type of approach? And then blue gives some examples of my personal multimedia artifacts, such as like a podcast. One of my talks about ethnic studies in the K through 12 environment, and then my personal website, if you want to be able to look at some of those materials. So hope you all are with me now. Okay, so after the color coding, I just want to back up a little bit. We want to make sure that during this process, as you're listening to me, it would be very helpful if you are into multitasking and feel comfortable with it. If you could really quickly make your own account for a Padlet, because that's where you're going to keep some of the record of what we're talking about today. It's very easy, it's free, you can sign up for it with Google, and it's actually a very interesting and cool pedagogical tool, as we'll see here in a minute as I share mine with you. So we're gonna try to be, doing two things at once here, listening, but also trying to put some of this into practice so that we leave with something today. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start off with intersectionality in first year composition. And we're looking a little bit at the framework. We want to look at what the framework is and how does this work? Okay. I would like for us to acknowledge, before talking specifically about why we start with feminism, how difficult it has been to talk about race and anti-racism in any educational and professional environment. I've written about it before, and when we start talking about race, discrimination, racism, a lot of emotions get evoked and invoked, right? And people start thinking about a lot of different things. And sometimes people will get triggered in some ways, and some other people will get threatened in some ways, and some people will actually feel empowered in some ways. We have to realize is that everybody has kind of a different emotion when bringing up the word race and anti-racism. And I've actually witnessed very recently that when we bring in further terms like whiteness or white supremacy, which a lot of people are hearing in the media, emotions even get more high and sometimes get triggered, and then people have a tendency not to really listen. So we have to really be mindful when we're thinking about this particular approach and understanding how, although we want ourselves to be committed to this type of approach, there are some things to be aware of. Okay. And so given that it is difficult to, get right into discussions on week 1 or week 2 about race and racism and anti-racism in the classroom, I have found that it's easier to get into some discussions of race by easing into the discussion, right? Not this all coming off at the first or second week talking about, you know, George Floyd and why we need to be police abolitionists, for example. We're not necessarily, you know, thinking about starting off on that particular position. So I have found it's easier to get into these discussions by talking about gender and feminism. And as I mentioned, my approach is very much a critical historical approach. So I like to talk about the history of feminism as an example that shows how movements have happened historically within our American society, right? Thinking about the freedoms that women were searching since the 19th century. Okay. So it's really important that we have an understanding at the very beginning of the course that we're going to be looking at histories that are tied with social movements. The first one being gender, the second one being class, and then the third one being race, okay? So when I say first, second, and third, say I have a 12-week course. So I want to think about that in terms of parsing out that course, because it's important for us to feel like, okay, we're scaffolding how this is going to work. If I have a 12-week course, for example, I might dedicate the first 4 weeks talking about gender, the movements behind gender, the second unit talking about class and all of the different types of approaches to class, a little bit of Marxism, but also Virginia Woolf, Naomi Wolf, things like the beauty myth. So kind of like generalized approaches to class and gender. And then the last unit, we actually do go into race and talking about the histories of race, such as the civil rights movement, but then bringing it more so to the present and talking about how the genome movement is really giving us a more in-depth understanding of how we understand race. Okay. So, so then I start off with gender. I know, long story short, but I'm just trying to give us a general overview of how this works here in the course. If we're sparsing it out into 3 units based on gender, class, and then race. So in the beginning, I ask students to consider how race plays a factor in social problems. And we start with that as a question, but we go back and we look at the history of feminism, okay? We consider the 3 waves of feminism. And then considering the 3 waves of feminism with, maybe starting off with a source like Wikipedia, and I have a colleague who has done so much work on the Wikipedia initiative that I know some professors like, wow, we don't really want to use Wikipedia, but it's actually a very nicely peer-reviewed source. There's been a lot of research done into it. But there are, of course, other sources, multimedia sources that we could look at to be able to introduce the students to the 3 waves of feminism. But talking about those 3 waves gets us to see how it ends up in the 3rd wave at an intersectional point, right? So the first wave, we're looking at voting rights. The second wave, we're looking at reproductive rights. And then the 3rd wave, we're looking at the integration and inclusion of women of color, specifically tied to the civil rights movement. So we can see how that also allows us to enter in discussions of race, but within the framework of feminism. Okay. More so on this particular column is tying, the ways that we talk about history and its legitimation within the field of writing studies. My approach is justified as well in critical history within how the field approaches its valuing of its own disciplinary history. So let me go ahead and share a little snippet of, at the end of my segment, I'm able to bring in what is the idea of intersectionality that allows us to talk about race at the end of that unit.
I like to try something new. Those of you who are hired women. But she applied for a job and she was not hired. And she believed that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say. That the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma de Graffenried was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African-American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But of course, neither African-American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination still standing.
Alrighty, so hopefully as you see me kind of clicking through the Padlet, you can see how it can also be used. But there we had an explanation from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is in legal studies and is very well known for creating the term intersectionality as it relates to the Say Her Name movement. And she is also a very well-known proponent of critical race studies. Some of you might have heard of critical race theory. I'm gonna plug in my earbuds so you might hear a little bit of a difference here. Some of you might be familiar with who she is and the term, but not necessarily familiar with the origins of the story. So we get to, also learn along with our students the history of intersectionality, but also then being able to problematize, right, a history of feminism that was predicated on white feminism. It allows us to see how women of color historically have been discriminated against. So I know we're all writing teachers and we might be asking the question, well, what are the students writing about at this time? Well, I wanted just to take just a brief moment to talk a little bit about the roles of the reading and the writing assignments during the first unit that concentrates on feminism and then ends up into discussions of intersectional feminism. So of course, we're bringing in short stories. We could also bring in some current events that relate to women of color all of a sudden gaining these very prominent positions, right, in the government and in the professional sphere, et cetera. But one of the things I do is I bring in some literary pieces. And here's one example here, The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. And it kind of really gets us to talking about the first wave of feminism and thinking about how women didn't necessarily have their own identity, right, apart from their husband. And their identity was based so much so on being domestic and being able to have that privilege to be domestic. And it gets us to talking about how freedom had a really different meaning for women in the 19th century. And so when we read this together, we practice some of our critical reading skills and critical reading exercises and critical thinking, right? Because we've already talked a little bit about what the different waves of feminism are. And then we're talking then about these representations of white women at this time period of feminism through fiction, but also nonfiction. And so, the approach to this critical reading strategy is very much tied to also my approach for teaching writing. We all understand that, in the first year composition course, especially since we're moving on from remedial approaches, it's veering away from the 5-paragraph essay, but it's also allowing us to experiment with genre at some point. At the very beginning, though, I do stress the Toolman model because I feel that it does give students the tools to be able to analyze readings, but also then to be able to construct their own arguments. So, I don't necessarily have the resource on the Toolman model, but it's something that's very easy to look up. The Toolman model is reference to Stephen Toolman. And you could, look that up. His book is called The Uses of Argument. I can actually drop that in the chat. So you're probably noticing then is that yes, I do pull my resources together. I don't necessarily have a textbook that I draw from. And most of my sources that I share with the students are accessible. So that's also really important, right? And just being accessible with the information. So what we would do with this reading is we might do a summary, and we might write it in the Tolman model. And what does that mean? For the Tolman model, we would be identifying things like the claims, we would be talking about the types of evidence used, and then we would give also our reflection on it. You know, how does it relate to, we would ask the question, how does it relate to the first wave of feminism? Students might do some kinds of reading responses to this. Right? So what did I write here? Early feminism was exclusive in who it considered to be privileged enough to call themselves feminists. However, it is important to bring in readings that consider various points of view surrounding the ideas, ideals, and experiences of feminism in order to understand what self-proclaimed feminists thought of themselves and their unique paths to liberation, which were clearly tied to their whiteness and traditional ideas of domesticity. So students are starting to gain this kind of critical lens on how feminism has been represented over history and how in some points it might have been exclusive, right? And not necessarily inclusive of a woman of color approach. Okay. And what is this next one here? All right, so I wanted to go on to one more reading exercise. That way we could see how would we scaffold this assignment, because we're also thinking about making connections among reading as a critical reading exercise, and also being able to have authors converse with one another, even across historical time periods, but also different experiences with feminism. Bell Hooks, for example, a Black feminist who identified as a queer feminist, wrote about the intersection of class and race, right? In this reading here, Keeping Close to Home. Let's see if I can open this. Keeping Close to Home, Class and Education by Bell Hooks. And I really, really love this story about Bell Hooks. It's an example of a nonfiction exploration, this particular author with her background, her history, coming from a working class background, and then getting admitted to an Ivy League institution, Stanford, and what that meant when her parents wanted her to stay home, which, you know, I feel like a lot of first generation students can relate to that experience, and, you know, how there's this conflict sometimes with what the family might be expecting from them, but also, you know, their own aspirations and goals and dreams, and trying to navigate, you know, that the push and pull factor there. But then also, you know, exploring the fact that once Bell Hooks gets into this environment of the Ivy League institution, she has so many different challenges and conflicts that she has to deal with. You know, because she's from this working class background, she doesn't necessarily have the academic aptitude or approach. She doesn't necessarily have the discourse. And what's interesting about Bell Hooks is that she's kind of just like, yeah, I didn't have it, but she's like, but so what? You know, I made it here. And so whether or not they were going to listen to me or going to validate me, you know, she was going to continue to advocate for herself and say how her realistic kind of down to earth approach, you know, was just as academic or just as worthy as some of the other kind of objective approaches that she would see in some of the academic conferences that she would attend. And so she also starts getting into questioning things like, you know, objectivity, you know, the working class, what it meant to talk African-American vernacular, for example. You know, these linguistics issues come up, and it allows us to also put this in conversation with the Virginia Woolf story, right? What were the different types of ways these women understood feminism? And what were the different types of privileges or not privileges that they had or that they experienced in terms of their struggles? And so we could see how that would give us an opportunity to bring in two different readings in the conversation, and also to be able to write a little bit about that. If students are able to connect to that, they can also bring in some of their personal connections there as well. I think what I'm communicating here is that the assignments are very much kind of academic oriented. They're not about the students' like own literacy narratives. You know, we're definitely thinking about anti-racist and also feminist practices and readings and subject matters. But we're not necessarily looking to the student to write about like their own cultural history, right? They're learning about histories, they're learning academic history. So they're learning about a discipline. Okay. One more example that I wanted to show there in terms of how we might approach the role of feminism in history is through a multimodal or multimedia assignment. Filipino historical ties to the United States. So I had a student who wanted to, you know, after reading about bell hooks and after reading about Virginia Woolf and reading about histories, critical histories, what are they? She wanted to know more so about her own historical ties. And so what we assigned a timeline of a particular discipline, and she decided to do the Filipino historical ties to the United States. So this is a timeline that's constructed by a student, you know, from a spreadsheet. So it's a really interesting multimedia assignment. And I know some of you might be thinking, yeah, I'm not all that tech savvy. Honestly, I'm going to tell you, I really am not either. But I try to bring in accessible tools. So, you know, definitely share the link of where this timeline was constructed. It's basically made from a Google spreadsheet. And so, like I said, I think it's important to be accessible to our students, but also for ourselves. There's sometimes a learning curve, which especially we've had to deal with COVID. But anyway, we're allowed to, in this kind of spreadsheet, put in links to videos and descriptions of different time periods that take us through a really interesting interactive timeline. These are images that the student would choose as well, and descriptions. So she wanted obviously to know more so about Manifest Destiny and the role that it played with the Filipino presence in the United States. The Treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo. And some present race relations. The Filipinos are somebody we don't necessarily concentrate on in terms of the Delano Great Boycott, famous with Cesar Chavez. So this is, you know, obviously a critical race story as well. Not very many people know about the Filipino involvement in the Great Boycott. So this student really got into it because some students will put maybe like 5 different things on their timeline, but this student was really excited about this assignment and wanted to know a lot more. So you could definitely look into each note of that assignment here when you look at the Padlet here. It's an example there. I'm just going to try to move the windows around because I can't see everything that well here. So, all right, so I'd like to go ahead and transition back to the worksheet that we have. And let's see if we could do a little activity. I don't want it really to take too long. I would hope that you'd be able to come back to this once our workshop is over with today to be able to consider some of these questions. But I feel like it's very helpful for us to kind of just debrief one step at a time. I want you all to be able to also see yourselves, even if you feel like you have a lot of distance from this type of approach, and what some of the barriers might be, and what some of the things you might be able to consider in order to get over some of those hurdles. So Brandon, is that okay if we can break out, if we could do a breakout room with about 4 people for about maybe like 10 minutes?
Yep, give me just a second to set up the breakout rooms.
Okay.
And we can do that. I'm doing that as we're talking. And then we have about 20 minutes left total.
Okay, great. So we can break out for about 10 minutes and then come back to debrief so I can kind of lead you with how to navigate the rest of the Padlet. I hope I've given you at least somewhat of an introduction of how you can work with it, as well as the color coding. But some of the questions I have would be, you know, what are some of your concerns about being an anti-racist educator? Where do these concerns, where do they come from? Are they issues that you see you might have yourself and not necessarily being able to teach it because you're not an expert? Or are there some other kind of technical barriers in terms of the software you might have to use or a type of multimedia approach? And then to consider what might be a remedy or solution to any of those hurdles or barriers. Are there things that we can address immediately, or are there things that are more structural and take time because of bureaucratic types of decisions and things that you'd have to worry about in order to make those changes? All right.
And I have the rooms ready to go
Okay,
if
great.
you want.
Yeah,
I'm going
go
to
for it.
open them up and we'll give them about 10 minutes, you said?
Yes, please.
Sounds good. Here we go.
Thank you. Okay.
I just started the recording again. Sorry, muted myself. Looks like people are back. So if you want to finish up, Edith.
Okay, great. Thank you all. Welcome back. I hope you were able to at least start reflecting on how you might see yourself as transitioning into becoming an anti-racist writing educator. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. All right. So I was told I have about 6 minutes left. I wanted to go ahead and try to conclude with, started off with the first unit. I'm going to go ahead and skip over the class unit, although I did mention that, readings like bell hooks explore both class and race. I want to go ahead and skip over until where might we end up in a course like this that is centered on the Tolman model and all of these kind of anti-racist resources. So by the time we get past the third unit on race, we're able to really start having readings converse with one another from different types of disciplinary foci. And we can possibly then come to a point where we can analyze a social problem from an intersectional lens, right? So a social problem, something that might definitely consider race relations in the United States from an intersectional lens. So let me give an example where we're at right now. So while we might not start off with the subject matter of police reform from the get-go, by the time we come to the final week of the semester, I feel like the students are then able and more willing to and prepared to talk about issues such as police reform or police abolition. And it's only one example. Students can choose from a list or a host of different social problems. Right now, I'm choosing that example because it's a hot topic right now. Police reform, police abolition, police brutality, etc. So by the time students come to the end, they're able to analyze this particular problem from an intersectional perspective. And at that time, too, they've been introduced to intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw, who considers herself a critical race theorist and has been a very strong proponent of the Say Her Name movement, in which then would allow us to also ask questions about police brutality against women of color, not just men of color, and the ways in which police brutality against women of color is oftentimes silenced. It can bring us into discussions of the femicide issues within Mexico as well, because we have that type of violence towards women of color, an intersectional issue, and the lack of justice, right, in response to those histories of femicide on the Mexico-United States border. So we're able to get into these really kind of in-depth discussions of social problems from an intersectional lens, and then ask the students to do some type of research paper, right, which will then be written in, from the Tolman model. Now, I do want to say, I feel like students, if they're multilingual, should have the opportunity to be able to delve into materials that are not necessarily written in English, and also be able to, if they have the ability to, write in their native language. I cannot always say I understand it 100%. So I do ask the students to translate. I think that's up to your individual decision. I say, please go ahead and feel free to write about this particular topic in your language or in your home language, or even in a different dialect. For the dialect, I wouldn't have them translate if it's a dialect of English, but I would have them translate if it was like Spanish or Chinese, Japanese, or a different language. And then the last thing I like to say with the research paper is that I require students to bring in a multimedia component. And one of the things that we go over from a scaffolding perspective is the creation of critical memes. And students love memes. And so when I ask them, like, we're going to create our own memes today, it's going to be related though to your writing assignment. They do get really excited because they start talking about all these, their favorite memes, and they all have their favorite ones. And we talk about how funny they are and relevant they are. So I give them this assignment here, and that's just where I'm going to be ending off today, is the critical meme exercise. Then I do have them integrate their critical meme into their research paper where it might seem relevant. And I do have them give a figure description of, why they chose this meme and what is it supposed to be contributing as far as critical commentary to their research paper. So we go over the definition of a meme. We talk a little bit about the history of the meme and ways in which the meme was, kind of very generalized, not necessarily political at all, not necessarily always humorous, just kind of like something that we could share that we all kind of just can connect to in one way. Right. And it connects us based upon an action or a behavior, feeling, etc. And then we talk a little bit about then what is a critical meme? And I've told them, and I give them examples of different critical memes that I've come across, as I come across them all the time on different types of academic circles on social media platforms. And this one I came across, and we talk about it, and it actually brings up a really interesting conversation about ethnic studies, anti-racism, civil rights, its place in education and educational movements. And we look at, how does it look when what this means is when a white professor is going to teach an indigenous studies class, or in some cases, a white professor that's going to go teach an anti-racist class, right? And we can kind of like approach this from a humorous way because, it's not always meant to be serious all the time. But then you have the image in the background, right, which is the angel of progress. Which is a representation of manifest destiny, bringing us, back to that timeline where the student was exploring the Filipino role in the manifest destiny. And so how that's kind of this image, a representation of what it feels like when something like that happens. And students can kind of just like laugh it off. Yeah, there might have been that thought in the back of my mind at one point, but is this really okay? And why should it be okay? Why, if people don't think it's okay, why is it not okay? We can get into this kind of like critical discussion. If their paper was about the history of ethnic studies, or how many professors of color are actually professors of ethnic studies in comparison to white professors that teach ethnic studies. Let's do a little study about that. And then they might bring this in, and it might just like give that little humorous twist to it. And so, students learn how to do this. There's all types of meme generators. The document is available on the Padlet, as well as a couple of examples of where students could get their meme generators. Many of them actually know how to make them from scratch, though, just from like PowerPoint slides and Google Slides. And I think I'm going to go ahead and end there because I definitely don't want to get over on Wonderful's time, but I did leave my email on the the instructions form, or the supplemental notes form. So if you have any questions about any part, please feel free to reach out, and thank you so much.
And thank you very much. I'm just going to add some commentaries. That was a fascinating piece on the critical meme in terms of taking something that is relevant to students today, something that they're very familiar with, but then taking a twist to it to say, how do you take a critical race theory approach to it? So not just for that, but for your whole presentation, I want to thank you, Dr. Iris Ruiz.
Thank you.
What's great about today's presentation is we're bringing two just stellar folks in the field. We're going to hear next from Dr. Wonderful Faison, and taking different perspectives. And you're going to hear from different ways of approaching anti-racist teaching and writing. To really be able to help you in your work. So Dr. Wonderful, if you want to take it over, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Brandon. I appreciate it. Dr. Ruiz, that was fascinating. I enjoyed every single bit of it. I actually just showed my students the TED Talks with Kimberly Crenshaw right there. I also enjoyed that whole new forum. So I might have to get in contact with you and talk about many different things. I truly enjoyed that. But off of that, and I always think that's fun to talk about all the things that we can do in class. And I always feel bad that I talk about many of the things that we as instructors don't want to do in class, and that's assess. right, is put a grade to this stuff, right? We want to give them the wonderful things, but we have to assess, unfortunately. And so I'm going to share my screen, and you know, my presentation for you all is very, very workshoppy. So the presentation that I'm actually going to show you is short in itself, and then we'll get to work. But we're going to talk a lot, and hopefully we're actually going to get a lot from this conversation that we get to share with one another and amongst one another. And let me just make sure I get my PowerPoint up. Yep, there it is. Okay. And there we go. Okay. So yes, we're going to look at teaching anti-racist writing and particularly student agency in labor rubrics, right? And so we're actually going to get to the idea of what student agency is, unpacking that, how I came to this concept of labor rubrics, right, which have been around for, a little bit, and what that actually might mean, some interesting findings. Right. But first, I wanted to start with this idea when we talk about anti-racist teaching or writing, you know, why we talk about it, why these things become a thing, right, is because of things like linguistic discrimination and racism, right? And these are two different things, even though they are tied. They are two things, even though they're tied. So, one, linguistic discrimination refers to unfair treatment, right, of an individual based solely upon the characteristics of their speech. Accent, size of vocabulary, syntax, right? Anyone who has a very thick Southern accent, right, probably might know what I'm talking about in that situation. A lot of people definitely understand when they hear something like accent, right, facing this type of linguistic discrimination. Linguistic racism, however, refers to the different opportunities, right, or the treatment of speakers of minority languages, including school students. And what happens is how we get to linguistic discrimination is because who gets to use what languages in school, right? As in wider society, is closely bound up with issues of access, power, and dominance. Members of minority language groups must learn the majority group language to participate in formal education. In this way, minority languages may be devalued and speakers of such languages potentially disadvantaged. So this is all tied up in ideas of formalized education, as well as formalized ideas of writing, right? Some of these things we've heard and known. I'm not trying to kill you all with theory, just giving you the base of where we're coming from and how we got there. With these different power relationships. I've always felt that one of the things that we don't do with students is we don't talk to students about how writing is within power dynamics and is within power relationships. And that's something that I've always thought we could do to begin to disrupt some of these problematic systems that are not only just racist, but also classist and at times sexist, right? They're very systemically flawed in very many ways. Right. So I thought one of the ways that we do that, right, is what kind of agency can students have? When I started thinking about labor rubrics, which come from Asao Nui's book on grading and labor criteria, right? His idea that students really wanted to be graded on work that was actually done, right? We rarely ever get to grade or our grades are rarely ever reflective of the improvement that students have made throughout, of course. So he wanted to better reflect that work and he came up with labor rubrics. I too thought this was a fascinating idea and said, I want to do the same thing, right? I want to reflect students' actual work, but I wanted students to have a hand in that. Right. So I thought maybe they should have a hand in how they're assessed, right, on these things, right? So I wanted them to tell me what they thought they should be assessed on, which meant that students had to have a hand in setting the expectations. All right, so here were 3 things that I asked students to help set expectations. I asked them the expectations of the project. When I show you all the rubric, their project was what someone would call a problem essay or an issue essay, right? One of those standards, write about a current problem, right? So this is what they did a rubric for, right? Their standard issue essay. So I asked them what their expectations of the project was, just cold. You all have to write an issue, write about an issue. What do you think you're going to be graded on? What do you expect to be graded on? Right. So their expectations of the product, the project. Then I asked them to create the categories off of their expectations. What did those categories look like? I just asked them 3 things. And then I asked them to place value. All right, just value. What are your expectations of the project? What are the categories? So you can separate out those expectations, divvy them up however you wish. And then how are you placing value? The rubric, uh-oh. These things just double up so much. Thank you. Excuse me. Sometimes I still don't quite know how to do the animations on PowerPoint. It's 30 years old. I'm sorry. But the rubric that students came up with was very interesting for their issue essay. I want to point out one thing before I talk to you about this rubric and what it showed me about students, what they expect, and some of the ways in which they may have been conditioned to think about language. I want to announce that these were honor students. Okay, these are honor students. So whatever that means to you in your head, I do need to make that differentiation that these were honor students and how they saw these expectations. So these samples that I'm going to give you, let me stop share so that I can actually pull up the sample. So I can't quite pull it up while I'm here. Make sure I have it up. Okay, I think that just, here we are. So when I came with the rubrics, here we go. You all see we have the student created rubric. And this will be given to you all as materials later. This is the student created rubric. I say student created because there is an instructor created one that we'll talk about. This is a student created rubric. And as you see, how students saw this was positive points and negative points. And it was 0 sum for these students. 0 sum. So they either got 40 points for having the knowledge or they didn't, right? But on that, if you look at what they wanted to be, they saw it as rewards and punishment. You look at what they wanted to be punished for. They wanted me to remove 20 points for errors and correcting and using language or linguistic variants. Any type of incorrect usage of that, they wanted me to actually take points away from that, punish them by 20 points, by 20, by 2 grades. 2 grades, right? Because we're on a 10-point scale. Now, also couple this with research skills, where this is our research writing class, our Comp 2. Couple this with research skills. They're like, well, I'm not really confident on that, but only take away 5 points. Which I would think is the most important thing. I need you to support what you are saying, right? Please support what you are saying. They only wanted to lose 5 points for that. So when I looked at what they were asking me to do, no matter how well they did on knowledge, they were always going to knock themselves down to average. There was a chance that by average, I mean C. They always had the potential to knock themselves down by 2.5 grades, right? If not done well. Now I'm going to show you the instructor created rubric because there are some other things up there that I actually think are troubling from an instructor point of view. And I'm just going to scroll down here. From an instructor point of view, what was most troubling to me, you'll see there are 2 things that are added. They're at the top, right? Dependability follows instruction. Students, they pick the values, right? So they wanted these things to be rewarded for these things. Honestly, you all, they have nothing to do with writing. They're wholly about compliance, right? There's nothing in that really has anything to do with writing and what they did in the paper. It's all compliance. So I looked at myself, recognizing that part of oppressive and systemic and structural issues have to do with people being out of compliance. Many of these students saw disciplining as punishment. Getting their writing to be disciplined, they had to be punished for. Now I was asking them to do these things like comply, dependability. It's important to follow in instructions and it's important for them to meet the deadline. We all know that, but it has nothing to do with writing, right? And so I found myself having this tussle where I found this thing that I thought to be freeing, liberating, right, in some way, might actually show more how confined, right, we still are, the minds, right, not only of the students, but also my own. And like I said, these are honor students. These are the ones who excel. These are the ones who probably comply the most, right? They excel. Again, I teach in an HBCU, right? So this is also very problematic, right? As a person of color, seeing these people of color who are saying, you punish me for using language. You need to punish me if it's not, absolutely correct. And you need to punish me by 2.5 grades. It's an interesting type of, what I thought anyway, to perceive as a self-flogging. What I've come down to is I may wind up taking these things away. Because they're so compliance related. It depends. What I will tell you all is that I had to have a conversation with my students about the zero sum. I told them that I can't in good conscience give you 40 points or no points. We all need a little bit of work. Can we go 40 points A, 30 points B? We were able to make those negotiations. Right. So I will say that I got them out of zero sum, but I thought it was very important for you all to see how they saw this. And for me, I've never gotten students to do plus minus. I've never had students do negative positive before. It was the newest thing for me. But I think, like I said, again, what labor rubrics exposed is that I think we still have work to do. We still have work to do in undermining certain systems. But what I think that this can allow us to do is it gives us a way to talk to students about writing, right? Which give us a way to talk to them about power and the power relationships and the inherent race and class and systems that are in there. If these are the types of conversations that you're wanting to engage your students in, and I'm hoping some of us are willing to engage our students in, we can see there's a very visual representation of oppression that we see happening and how these students are wanting to be punished and then wanting instructors to comply with that punishment. So with that, I'm actually going to go back to my PowerPoint. So with that, I wanted to get to takeaways. But before I wanted to get to takeaways, this is where I wanted to have you all in the breakout rooms. Again, I was hoping that Brandon could put us in breakout rooms. Brandon, do I need to give the PDF of the rubrics in there, or do you already
No,
have it to give them?
I would put it in the chat now, because once we're in the breakout rooms, it won't broadcast. So if you put it now, then
Okay.
it'll be in everybody's.
All right, let me do that right now. Give me just a second.
And then after you do that, what I will do is I will open up the rooms again. People
Okay.
will need to join the rooms. I can set them up and then people will need to join them. But let's get that PDF first in the chat.
Okay, and actually it's a Word document, so it should be easier for everyone. And what I actually would like for you all to do is take a look at these rubrics, right? Knowing what I said about what students, expect. And I want you to take a look at these rubrics in your own mind with the own types of rubrics that you have created. And I want you all to come together and come with ideas that you could talk with your students about what this says about power, expectations, right, of assessment, what this says about what they think about writing, right, like those relationships. What conversations about writing, right, do you think that you can now begin to engage with your students with when you look now at rubrics like this, which tell you how they value and where they place value on writing? What kind of conversations do you think you can begin to have with your students about this? And finally, what do you think you might have? What type of conversation you think you might be having with yourself? All right, I started having some significant conversations with myself. But how do we talk to students about writing when it comes to these types of assessments? If we're looking at having students have agency, right, in the way that they're assessed, how are we talking about that? How can this help us open conversations about how they look at writing, the power of the class, the race, how we look at writing?
Perfect.
Okay.
I have the room set up and I will
All
be
right.
able to push people into the rooms. I click the right button. As people are coming back, I'm going to start the recording again. So welcome back, and back to you, Dr. Wonderful.
Okay, so before I have you all share out on your own takeaways of what you saw and how this helped you talk about things or see some things, I thought I'd go ahead and talk about my own takeaways as soon as I can go ahead and get up here and share it. Okay, there we go. Okay, there we go. There were a couple of takeaways there that we had on all sides. Like I said, it could lead to conversations about the relationship between writing and systems of power or oppression. May expose, right? Exploitative aspect of labor rubrics. Labor rubrics are really hot right now, and it could expose some potential problems of that. Obviously, it shows how students view language, but more specifically, their home language or their own language. Um, some positives, though, it really did increase student engagement and investment. Like, they really cared about this. They really talked about this as a group and decided on this. So, like, there were a lot of, I guess, like, working together that happened, democratic principles that were happening. They negotiated, they talked, right? They cared. You would say, of course, they cared about their grades, but the level of engagement did increase mightily, right? They were invested. And of course, it gave them agency. And agency is something that is given, right? Students do not, we as students never set the standards by which we learned or were assessed. We just took the test and we did the work, and that is the same here. So when you allow students a part in that process, you are giving them some agency in it. As well. So I thought that that is where we could then talk a bit about your own takeaways that you all had. I wanted to give you all time to share about your own takeaways. So I kind of now turn the floor over to you all as a group, and we could share about your takeaways with this exercise or these labor rubrics and what they could mean.
Are you okay if individuals unmute themselves to talk?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Let's do that then. Would anyone who is on the webinar like to unmute to be able to share some of your takeaways from the small group and through the labor rubrics?
So I'll share. Our group was super fun. We talked a little bit about how interesting it was that they wanted to take away that many points for language. And we talked about how that might open up a dialogue about values, like where does that value come from? Is it your value about writing? Is it something that you picked up along the way? And so the idea of negotiating values in the classroom is something that came up. We also were curious, Dr. Wonderful, if you had what kind of preface you gave them, or like lead up into this kind of negotiation. Did they talk about rubrics beforehand? Did they talk about expectations beforehand, or was this kind of going in and just seeing what they thought about writing? So that's something that we had talked about, like what it would look like with different preparations.
Right. Well, it started off, at the beginning with, hey, you all tell me what you expect to learn in a Comp 2 course. Right. So what was that, which is, I said, our research writing course. So it started all the way back then with finding out what their expectations of a composition, course was, or our equivalent English 102. Right. So I think that was the first thing, is that set the standard that they already were playing some type of part in crafting expectations that I was building off of some of the expectations that they had. Some of them, like I said, many of them were, yep, that's exactly what it is. I mean, some of them were clearly way off. Right. But many of them, more of them, were in line than not. So they started with that. And I mentioned to students that I often had students create rubrics because if students could help create how they would assess, I thought that they would be more invested. I thought that they would work harder. I thought that they would turn things in on time. And I very much just explicitly said that to students. I think if you do this, then maybe you'll be more invested and maybe you'll turn the stuff in on time and you'll work a little bit harder, right? So I was transparent with them about why. And so that's kind of how we wound up getting there. That's how we wound up getting there. We never really discussed, I never thought about value because I used to do rubrics as an equal thing. Every category was just equally weighted. It was just easier for me with math. I never saw changing numbers until I started doing this with students. And so I thought that was a very interesting observation. I hope that answers your question. Does that answer your question?
It does, because we were kind of talking about with the power dynamic in the classroom, if you speak first or you assign something for them to read before they create their rubric or negotiate a rubric, then you're kind of setting the stage of them trying to maybe please you in addition to try to get themselves, into a good situation with their rubrics. So I have done this before, and I've done it in a way where I think I introduced it maybe too much with my values through the textbook and all that sort of thing. And so while it was really fun and they got to use their own language, like we would say, what's an A paper? And they would say lit, or they would use some other word for what that was. It was fun, but I don't think it did what yours did, which is bring their ideas up to the surface before they even hear what you think or what the classroom's going to be about. So we saw a lot of value in seeing what the students thought first.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a good thing. And I actually see a lot of kind of the value and also the way that you did it as well, because I think that sets them up for different things. So definitely value in doing these things in different ways and applying them in different ways. Certainly. Would anyone else like to chat? We have a few more minutes before we would open the floor generally to any questions that you might also have for Dr. Ruiz. So is there anyone else who wants to kind of share what their group discussed or talked about before I turn it back over to Brandon?
I was in the same group as Robin, but I just wanted to say that, you know, the exercise that you shared with us and talking about it was just like a real, like, oh, moment for me looking at it when you said that those, you know, student generated rubrics were really all about compliance. That just, I mean, it's not that I hadn't thought about that before, but I really hadn't thought about that before in that way. And especially because I've been, over the past couple semesters, really finding myself drawn to like labor-based grading contracts and students having more of a say in sort of what they're being evaluated on. And you know, thinking about this exercise has really made me not hesitant necessarily to move in that direction, but it's really helped me kind of qualify or maybe put boundaries on like what that actually will look like in the classroom, like how much sort of a give and take that will need to be in terms of how I'm structuring the class. So I found that really, really valuable.
Oh, no, awesome. Yeah, it's a constant work in progress. I was telling Brandon, as you all were out of the group, that you know, I'm also the chair of the department, so we have to look at, quote, this weird type of data, you know, in different types of ways. And that's also what has me looking obviously at rubrics and grading and, you know, all of these types of things is this data to meet these weird arbitrary marks and how we get closer to that. So I'm mostly happy that this is a tool or something that's getting everyone, you know, kind of thinking about, you know, whether they should pump the brakes or just nuance this some more. Really, like I said, talking to your students about expectations and what they think is supposed to be happening in the classroom. Brandon, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you for final questions and whatnot.
Sure, and I just want to make one quick comment while you were in the break. As I mentioned earlier, this session is combining different perspectives on a similar topic, and I think that the two complement each other really well. So I challenge you to find ways in your own classes to be able to pull the two together. So just one example, at the end, Dr. Ruiz talked about critical memes, right? And so taking something that's very daily for students, but then taking a critical race approach to it. So what would happen if you combine that with what Dr. Faison is talking about through the labor-based grading and the encouraging of the students to participate in it, so that students are looking at those power dynamics and how hegemonic structures exist both through others' writings in society, and then actually participating in that with them by themselves in the classroom. So ways that you can combine the two to have two different approaches. So just a little bit of commentary from me, but I want to open up our remaining time for questions for either of our two wonderful presenters. If you have a question, just unmute yourself, or you can type it in the chat, or you can certainly raise your hand and we can call on you. Raise your hand virtually, that is. So any questions for our presenters or comments, thoughts?
I have a question for Dr. Ruiz, if I may ask. So some of the texts that you mentioned you include in a Composition 1 course are pretty difficult. I mean, they're difficult even for more advanced literature courses, Kate Chopin, Virginia Woolf. And I'm just wondering how students deal with this difficulty, because I wonder if we were to include these readings for Comp 101, I'm just not sure how I would introduce the text so that they are more approachable for students.
Thank you for that question. Kate Chopin, The Story of an Hour, is actually very accessible. It's a fictional story. It's a short story. I think, you know, much of it is a creative writing representation. I think, you know, students in high school, 11th and 12th grade, read pretty high level literature. I'm actually surprised when I ask my students, because it's one of the introductory questions that I ask my students every semester, is what their last writing assignment was. And they're often telling me that they're reading people like Tanashi Coates. You know, some of them have already done some work in intersectionality, but so I feel that they're accessible. And then the Naomi Wolf reading comes like at the second unit when we're talking about the beauty myth, because it's really related to class. So I understand, you know, there might be initial concern about the difficulty of the reading, but I spent a lot of time the first couple of weeks talking about how to diagram. Sorry, I have a plane in the background, you can probably hear it. How to diagram reading, which the Tolman model really gives the tools to be able to do that, to diagram reading. We do the first couple of diagrams together. So we'll take the reading paragraph by paragraph and talk about like what each paragraph is doing rhetorically, like what is the purpose of each paragraph within a reading. So even with a short story like Kate Chopin, we would do that in a class reading workshop. So I do reading workshops just as much as I do writing workshops. I think it's really important to teach critical reading. And so I have students also do weekly journals in which they're responding to the reading to make sure that they are comprehending the reading. I haven't really had any students complain about the level of difficulty of the reading until we get to the last unit, which is then we would, you know, talk a little bit more about science, like a scientific approach to understanding race, or even delving into, you know, a little bit of critical race theory, like Omi and Wynant, for example, in the last unit. But I feel like because we've already spent about 10 weeks working on comprehending the reading, understanding and how to respond to readings, and understanding how to put them in conversation with one another, that students are, they become, you know, much better at reading after about 10 weeks or so. So I just I can't stress enough how much we actually concentrate on reading with annotations, rhetorical outlines, outlining the reading, and journaling of the reading as well. So that's probably how I would approach it, but definitely in an incremental level, like not just, you know, starting off with the most difficult readings, but starting off with some of the shorter stories and some of the more accessible readings. The book that I did initially use was called the Norton Mix, and it's, you know, a book of short readings, short stories, and they're meant to be accessible to first year and second year students. I just happened to find them online to make them accessible and free. I hope that answers the question. If you have a follow-up question, I'd be happy to answer it.
Oh, no, that answers the question. And actually, I was in another workshop with you at UNR a few weeks ago, and again we had a discussion in our groups about some instructors not actually knowing themselves how to approach these texts, and I have taught these texts before too in literature courses, and I know that even in literature courses that are more advanced, students have difficulty understanding them. So it was just a general question, but I see what you mean with this kind of close critical reading and using various methods. So thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I think one of the most difficult texts I've seen be used in a first year composition course is Gloria Anzaldua's How to Tame a Wild Tongue, right? It's very, very complex. I could see that being something that comes in like the last unit with race and talking about intersectionality. And I think it's in David Bartholomew's Ways of Reading, which is, you know, also a reader for first year composition. So I feel like, yeah, sometimes we have to go out on a limb a little bit. But I'd also be curious to hear from you all, because you all are professionals as well, as like, what would you think is an entry level reading to include like in the first, you know, unit or the first few weeks? What kind of reading would you use in the first year composition course that you feel would be accessible? Wonderful. Do you have any ideas on that? Like what are some of the readings that you would use in the
Oh, the
beginning?
chat box is going off.
I see it.
Yes.
So one person wrote Only Daughter by Sandra Cisneros.
Hmm.
Two Kinds, The Things They Carried.
Yeah, it sounds like those are some complex topics too. And I love Sandra Cisneros. I just love her book.
I like Elephant in the Village of the Blind.
Someone also added Mother Tongue by Amy Tan.
Yes. Yes. And actually, thank you for bringing that up because we do a film screening. I actually do teach film, but I think it's important to bring in some films too. Oh, Richard Wright. Love Richard Wright too. We watched the Joy Luck Club. And we read the piece by Maxine Hong Kingston, No Name Woman, because I do like to talk about, the Asian experience as well in Asian history. And we put those into conversation with each other and it works really well. I don't have that on the Padlet, but yeah, the Maxine Hong Kingston, the No Name Woman, and then the movie The Joy Luck Club have some really interesting connections and similarities that go together. And it's kind of nice for students. I guess it would also make it more accessible, right, for them to be able to see a media representation that connects with the story that they're reading. The library card? Oh, wow. Okay, it's from The Black Boy. I have that book right here on the shelf right next to me. I have actually all of Richard Wright's books. One of my favorite authors, for sure.
I think we have time if anyone has another one or two questions for either of our presenters today.
How about the lesson, Dr. Ruiz?
Which lesson was that?
That particular story, the lesson by Tony K. Bombara. That's one that I often give in our intro to
What were the
to
two
literature
titles that you
course.
said? The lesson, and then you had, what was the first one you said about an elephant?
There's another one called Elephant in the Village of the Blind, but I was just thinking of as an introductory text in general.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you want to put the authors to those in the chat as well, because I'm not sure who they are.
And just I want to give one more chance in case there's any other questions or comments.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of too how to approach some of these, you could probably imagine how just having kind of a general understanding of the history of feminism within the United States, how one might be able to, or a student might be able to see some of the examples and how, each one of these authors talking about their own experience is an example, right? An embodied example of their own feminist experiences, their own coming to terms with themselves, of coming to terms with their own identities, challenging them, the ways that they manifest in different kinds of societies and cultures. Patriarchy is an issue. I know in the Latinx culture, there's the issue of machismo. So we get into being able to talk about culture. Patriarchy and masculinity, femininity, and you do have to provide and front load some of these themes to the students for them in order for them to be able to recognize and see them in the readings as well. We don't want to just make it all guesswork either. We want to be able to give them the tools. Oh, it looks like there's a hand up.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Robin Road, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I had a question that I've been grappling around in my mind for a long time, which is kind of the language question. So both of you touched on allowing, I guess allowing is the right word, allowing people to use the language that they feel most comfortable with, whether that's like a dialect or a home language, or at least the idea of not maybe marking down, or what would it look like to not mark down for not using standard American English. And so I've attended some workshops on it, one by Vershawn Young. And so it really got me thinking, how can I do this in an effective way? I love what he said about no language is a deficit. language is always an asset. But I'm curious how you do that in your own classrooms, where you make it so people can understand it, but so that people are also sharing their own linguistics.
Well, you know, it's odd because for me at an HBCU, I think it's been a whole lot easier because of the situation that I'm in, the demographic that I'm in. The language is quite understood, right? This becomes about, you know, the things like punctuation. Like, did you use this in an introductory, you know, clause or not? When it's understanding, it becomes talking to them more about intent, specifically talking to them about intent, which is something that I find that students don't understand, right? Is that writing has an intent, right? So this allows me to talk to them about intent. You know, I understand exactly what you're saying. We're good, as is the punctuation, you know, and all of that. As long as this is what you intend to say and do, right? As long as you understand that this is what you intend to say and do, then we're fine, right? And that's the discussion that we have. My only concern is when they don't have that intention, right? When it's like when a student can't say what they want to say, and so they cover it up with a cliche or a metaphor, right? They might not have the intent, right? So I just need to make sure that it's intent then but like I said, that's because I'm situationally placed. I'm geographically placed. I might be working with students who are more comfortable writing this way, right? Because they have a teacher with a face like me. And so they make their own personal assumptions there, right? Like, I also taught at predominantly white institutions. I don't remember encountering that much of verbose, right, African-American vernacular language in there, that it was so intolerant, you know, but not so much here. I encounter it all the time. You know, and so it's very interesting. So I think it's situationally placed, but it's always about intent. Did you intend to do this way? Right. And that's what I assess is intent.
Yeah, I like the idea of it being situationally placed. I teach a foodways essay, and in one of my themed courses on Chicano studies, because I do a themed writing course on Chicano studies, and we do a unit on food, and we talk about, like, you know, cultural foods. So I tell the students I feel like culture and food and language are very intimately tied to one another. And if there's a situation in which they want to talk about how food is a family tradition and this takes place in their native language, to please, you know, share that and however that looks like and however that sounds like, and a way that allows them to represent the different facets of who they are. And they do that through this kind of ethnographic research, right, that's centered around that food, that dish. And I feel like it's situationally minded, that in that particular situation, you would want to allow the students to be able to play with genre, their native language, or different type of dialects. Like I said, and if you feel like, oh, well, I don't understand Spanish, I feel completely comfortable with asking the student to translate, you know, maybe in an appendix or something like that, if it's important to be able to do that.
Thank you so much. I wish we had more time. We are actually at the hour. So a couple quick notes. I did put a link to an evaluation if you can just take a couple minutes to fill that out. I also put in the chat a Word document that has our upcoming, our final 2 sessions, which will both be next week. I'm showing them on my screen now. Again, the one on the 27th does have a different registration because it was added late, as well as the ones from prior, so you can go back and share with your colleagues or yourself if you missed in the recordings. More than that, I want to give a very warm and heartfelt thank you to Dr. Iris Ruiz and Dr. Wonderful Faison for really taking different approaches to this very complex and hugely important topic of anti-racist teaching and writing. So thank you both to both of you, and thank you for everyone for participating, and we'll see you at our next sessions.
Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.